Hello, I'm Jackie Spinner. I'm a journalism professor at Columbia College Chicago. When I was a reporter in Iraq and Afghanistan, I got used to putting on body armor before grabbing my notebook or camera. My vest was blue, a specific shade worn by most journalists in the field. That blue carries a history. It traces back to 1947 when the UN adopted a light blue flag, a symbol of peace in the chaos of conflict. Over time, the blue became something even more, a signal that the person wearing it was neutral, press, not a combatant. I'm here to tell your story, to find out what really happened, to let the world know. But today, I want to talk about a different kind of armor, not the kind that protects you from shrapnel, but the kind many of us wear every day, especially women, especially working parents. This talk is about what happens when you take off your body armor. It's about war reporting, yes, but also about teaching, parenting, and new connections. In Vietnam, most reporters wore camouflage, trying to blend in. But by the time of the Persian Gulf War, we started to make a different choice, to stand apart. Because in war, journalists are not soldiers. We don't carry weapons. We don't take sides. We carry pens and cameras and ask questions. We are witnesses, not warriors. And no matter what country we come from or what passport we carry, our job is the same, to show what's happening and to hold people accountable for the decisions they make. That blue uniform of mine weighed about 12 pounds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when it's 120 degrees in the shade, and you're running from bullets and bum blasts or trying to crouch and hide, making yourself as small as possible, those 12 pounds carry all of your history and hopes and dreams. Those 12 pounds can make a difference in whether you survive. In 2011, when I moved to Chicago from the Middle East to begin a new career as an assistant professor here at Columbia College, I brought my body armor with me. This particular vest wasn't blue, because after I left the Washington Post and returned to the Middle East as a freelance reporter, I had to borrow dark brown body armor from the US military's Combined Press Information Center, which managed embeds in Iraq. When I was ready to go home, they didn't need me to return it. It was old and the US was preparing to leave Iraq anyway. I guess I did them a favor. I kept the body armor in my office now. And when I teach my War Stories class every January, I let my students try it on. See how heavy it is? I ask them. Can you imagine running with it? Can you imagine sprinting from death with this on? But what I really want to ask is, can you feel what it's like to carry the weight of needing to be perfect, of knowing that small mistakes can cost your life, of carrying the weight of survival when you make it and somebody else doesn't? It's not just heavy in the moment, but even after you take it off, can you feel how the very thing that is meant to keep you safe also weighs you down for years and decades after? In those early years, if anyone asked, and probably even if they didn't, I would tell them I was a journalist who teaches. I missed daily journalism, and I missed war, and I missed the clarity it brought. I missed telling stories that mattered most. I didn't yet understand that the classroom would become a new kind of frontline, and that teaching could become just as urgent. I modeled my teaching after the best journalists I had known. Neil Henry was my professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Neil was a great teacher because he was a great journalist. Africa bureau chief for the Washington Post, investigative reporter, 5-time Pulitzer nominee. He checked all the boxes and taught me through his reporting principles, his ethics, through his war stories and his journalism. When I became a teacher myself, I quoted Neil in my classroom. I still do, borrowing his stories and adding my own. That's because his teacher made me the journalist I ultimately became. Neil told this story about how he'd get accurate body counts in Africa by visiting the morgue. It was the only way to know for sure how many people had died in whatever conflict or natural disaster he was covering. Did you count the bodies? He would ask us. Did you count the bodies became a core principle of the journalism I practiced and it has guided me through my entire journalism career. When I had a classroom of my own, I'd ask my own students, and I still do, did you count the bodies? Now, not all of my students in those early years of my teaching were ready to count the bodies. I was an intense, hard, unbending teacher. They called me the drill sergeant behind my back, and I didn't mind. I loved my tough exterior. It seemed to be confirmation to me that I was doing right by the next generation of journalists. Back then, I had zero tolerance for lateness. I couldn't stand excuses. I wrote in my syllabus, and it stayed there for years. If you miss the plane, you miss the war. Because I set the bar so high for myself to stay alive, I kept it there for my students. I told my students a lot of war stories, but I didn't tell them about the kid from Central Illinois whose father worked construction, who never went to college, the child whose family relied on food baskets because the plumbers and pipe fitters union, where my dad was a member, was between jobs. I didn't tell them about the Washington Post intern, newly arrived in DC, living out of her car at a campground until I could find an apartment I could afford. I didn't share the awkward new Washington Post hire who didn't know how to navigate dinner parties in DC, who was surrounded by colleagues who went to Ivy League schools. I didn't share the process I went through to build a mental armor that would keep me from feeling like an imposter every time I rode the elevator up to the 5th floor to the Post newsroom. Now, in Iraq and Afghanistan, this armor was essential. Stay focused on the story, not yourself. Stay vigilant. Don't stop to feel. Feeling makes you vulnerable. Vulnerable people make mistakes. Mistakes can get you killed. You'll learn to share selectively in a war zone, especially one in which you are being hunted as a foreigner, an infidel, and we were hunted. I had agreed one time in Baghdad to give a talk at the US Embassy. It was informal, just me without my armor, talking about what it was like to be an American reporter in Iraq. An Iraqi journalist took what I said and printed it on the front page of a newspaper. My name went to the top of the insurgents' list of targets. They put a $50,000 price tag on my head, which frankly I felt was a little low, but I had to leave the country for a few days, escaping to Jordan. Needless to say, I didn't share much after that. So this is the person, this survivor of war, this guarded journalist whom my first students saw in the classroom. I really cringe now thinking about that early me as a teacher and a colleague, the intensity in which I moved. And then I became a mother. I couldn't hide behind my armor anymore. The first time I really realized what it was like to walk without armor was right after the judge in Morocco granted me custody of my first son. I have 3. It was a Friday, and in Morocco, everything closes by late morning for Friday prayers and couscous. It's the start of the weekend. I was with the other couples who had adopted, the moms and dads with their new children, parents who had each other to navigate the early moments of parenthood. I walked out of the courthouse alone. Unable to find a taxi, I carried my son 2 miles back to my apartment. That beautiful little baby eventually became a toddler who was diagnosed with autism when he was 2. It was just a few weeks before I left for Morocco to adopt my second son, who arrived home very sick with a staph infection and asthma. I would like to share inspiring stories with you about those first years because they really are the years that I started to change as a teacher when I became a mother. But I had a newly diagnosed autistic child and an infant. Columbia wouldn't let me take maternity leave because I had adopted, a policy that fortunately has been changed. But can you imagine? Within weeks of taking my second baby home from an orphanage in Morocco, I was back in the classroom, overwhelmed, exhausted, scared, and still trying to keep my armor on. I kept going when my second son was also diagnosed with autism at age 2. I need to add here that a few years later, he lost that diagnosis, which I wrote about for the Washington Post. But at the time, I was really overwhelmed by the responsibility I felt to do right by these 2 humans. So I kept going, even though in the midst of all the joy of being a teacher and a mother, and there were so many moments of joy, I felt like I was drowning. Did any of my colleagues see this? Did my students? I might not have been wearing my vest and helmet, but it was still there. I spent those early years as a mother and a teacher on the absolute brink, one foot dangling over the edge. I wouldn't say I was pretending to be okay. I was mostly okay. I loved being a mother. It was the best assignment I ever had. It was just really, really hard. People said, but you've been to war, you can handle this. The thing is, war had taught me to endure, not to ask for help. It taught me to keep moving, to shoulder the changes alone. And for a while, I did just that. But slowly, something shifted. And I can't tell you that this was purposeful in any way, but I started to share some of the hard parts with my students. In turn, they started to share some of the hard parts with me. I started to see them really as another mother's child, and it took me being a mother myself to get there. I still told them that if they missed the plane, they missed the war. If any of my students are watching this, please know that I still expect you to come to class on time. Even my 10-year-old knows that we always arrive at soccer early because if you're on time, you're late. But also, sometimes things happen. Sometimes you won't give yourself enough time. You take on too much. You overschedule. You forget an appointment or a meeting. And when that happens, as I had to do just a few weeks ago, when I forgot I had scheduled a meeting with a student, you apologize. You give yourself grace. You make a course correction to minimize the chance it will happen again. At the Columbia Chronicle, where I am the faculty advisor, I often invite my students to do after-action reports, a military term, because some things just are so deeply embedded. When the students make a mistake, they acknowledge it. They apologize for it. They try to figure out what happened. They change or patch the system, whatever needs to be done to minimize the chances it will happen again. And they're student journalists, so they learn just as I learned as a young reporter. Colossal mistakes, I share them. I share about the time I got the name of a firefighter wrong after a months-long investigation reporting on a firehouse in Oakland. I undermined all the work I did with a simple mistake. I share about the time I did a profile for the Washington Post and wrote that County Executive Wayne Curry frequented Home Depot when everybody knew he was a Lowe's man. Another story undermined by a small error. I share about my billions mix-up when I was covering the SEC as a business reporter. I will take that one to my grave. This is the most challenging part of the transformation. I don't help my students prepare for careers, especially in journalism, if I don't teach them the importance of accuracy, of protecting their credibility, of being transparent, and about deadlines. I don't help my students by teaching them to be content in the middle. This will not only limit their dreams, it will keep them from being employed. I may be softer, but I still peddle in facts. And if there is a softer, more vulnerable version of me in the classroom, that person only makes frequent appearances in the student newsroom. I still wear a kind of armor. I'm a single mom with 3 kids, a full teaching load, and a relentless drive to do right by the stories I'm trusted with, and with the newsroom I advise. But the armor I wear now, it's different. These days, I try to wear a crown, not an armor. I stay organized, I multitask like a queen, I still show up early, I still set high standards, and I still push my students hard. But now I try to do it with a little more compassion, because my life isn't a war story anymore. It doesn't have bullets or bombs, but I'm still a warrior. In the battlefield I care about now is the classroom and the student newsroom, the spaces where vulnerability become power and where telling the truth, especially your own, is the most courageous thing that you can do. Thank you.